Hi guys, tonight we're going to step quietly into a shadowy part of history, a place where official rules meant little and survival often depended on bending them. This is the story of the black markets during the Second World War, hidden networks of trade that thrived behind closed doors, under dim lights, and in the silence of whispered deals. These secret exchanges touch soldiers, civilians, and governments alike, shaping lives in ways most history books leave untold. Before we get started, if you enjoy exploring hidden corners of history at a slower pace, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. I'd love to connect with you there. Imagine a city during wartime blackout, its streets dim, only the occasional glimmer of a lantern slipping through curtains. Official stores had empty shelves, ration books could buy less each month, and families quietly worried about how to stretch their next meal. In this atmosphere, the black market emerged, not just as a place of greed, but as a shadow economy born from necessity. People needed shoes, bread, or soap, and often the only way to get them was through networks of hidden sellers who risked punishment to trade what the official system could not provide. In London, Paris, Berlin, Moscow, and countless smaller towns, black markets became the silent pulse beneath everyday life. They were built on secrecy, but also on a strange sort of trust. Trust between strangers, between neighbours, even sometimes between occupier and occupied. To understand the world of wartime black markets, we must picture both the desperation and the ingenuity of people living with constant shortages. Take London in the early 1940s, for example. Rationing was introduced to make sure everyone got their fair share, but reality was harsher. Sugar, butter, meat, clothing, everything was limited. Housewives exchanged tips on where to find extra eggs or how to stretch tea leaves for another pot. Still, even with careful saving, there was never enough. And so, late at night, people would knock on quiet doors or slip into back rooms where forbidden goods were exchanged for cash. A bar of real chocolate could cost a day's wages, yet mothers bought it for their children's birthdays, because small joys mattered even more in hard times. Across the Channel, in occupied Paris, the picture grew even more complex. German officers themselves often became customers of the black market, using it to obtain French wine, cheese, or cigarettes beyond their official rations. For ordinary Parisians, these markets were both a lifeline and a danger. Buying or selling outside the ration system could lead to arrest, fines, even prison. Yet many chose to risk it, because the alternative was hunger. Farmers secretly traded butter or milk directly to city families, bypassing government quotas. Hidden cafes served meat that may have come from questionable sources, and money changed hands in whispers, in alleys, in markets that seemed empty by day but alive with quiet footsteps at night. Soldiers, too, became entangled in this secret economy. An American GI might trade cigarettes, a British soldier might barter canned food, while German troops sometimes sold fuel or supplies they had stolen. War blurred the lines between right and wrong, and the black market was the clearest example of that blur. Was it criminal to sell a loaf of bread if it kept a family alive? Was it immoral to buy a little extra fuel when winter nights froze entire cities? These were not questions with easy answers, and each person made their own quiet decision. Behind the scenes, governments tried to crack down on illegal trade. Police set traps, courts handed out punishments, and propaganda posters warned people not to deal with black marketeers. In Britain, posters showed shadowy figures offering goods with the warning, "Don't feed the black market." In France, German authorities posted decrees against unauthorized trading, though many officers broke those rules themselves. In the Soviet Union, punishment could be severe, yet black markets thrived in secret corners even under strict control. Wherever rules grew tighter, the underground economy grew stronger, and so, as bombs fell and armies marched, another war unfolded in silence. A war of hidden transactions, secret routes, and quiet exchanges. It was not about battles or front lines, but about survival, about keeping life going in a world where official supplies were never enough. Tonight we begin tracing that hidden story piece by piece to understand how ordinary people navigated an extraordinary shadow world. In Berlin during the height of the war, the black market took on a peculiar and dangerous character, shaped by the unique pressures of living inside the capital of the Third Reich. Officially, rationing was meant to guarantee fairness, but as shortages deepened, the gap between official supply and human need widened into a chasm. City streets at night were patrolled by police and air raid wardens, yet behind shuttered windows deals were quietly arranged. Housewives carried cloth bags not filled with official rations, but with items meant for exchange. A little butter traded for soap, or a pair of worn shoes for a few lumps of sugar. Cigarettes became more than a pleasure. They were currency. A single pack could buy vegetables. A few bars could mean an entire chicken. For many, it was easier to pay in tobacco than in Reichsmarks, since the currency itself lost trust in daily life. Soldiers on leave often brought back foreign goods, slipping chocolates or cans of food into the hands of waiting families, who in turn knew how to pass them through the invisible threads of the underground market. Children became messengers, carrying small parcels through side streets, their innocence a shield against suspicion. Yet the risks were never far away. The Gestapo kept watch, and penalties for illegal trade could be harsh. Stories spread of traders caught and punished, yet these tales did little to stop the activity. Hunger was a stronger force than fear. In some cases, even officials looked the other way, accepting small bribes or quietly joining in the system themselves, for they too had families to feed. The black market in Berlin was not just about food. Clothing was precious, especially in cold winters when coal was scarce. Families patched and repatched coats until fabric could hold no more stitches. A few merchants secretly unravelled old uniforms, reshaping them into civilian clothes and selling them at high prices. There was also a hidden trade in medicines. Pharmacies had limited stock, and those who could not obtain prescriptions often turned to whispered contacts who offered pills, syrups, or bandages at enormous costs. In basements and back rooms, candles lit scenes of quiet bargaining, where desperation wore many faces, mothers pleading for baby formula, old men trading tools for bread, students offering books for fuel. It was a world where every object gained new meaning, every item could become a key to survival. Even as bombs fell on Berlin, flattening buildings and sending crowds to shelters, the black market adapted. In those underground shelters, small exchanges continued, with whispers carrying in the dark. A piece of chocolate became a treasure shared among children, a reminder of normal life in a time of ruin. For many Berliners, the black market was not about luxury, but about the fragile thread that connected them to survival. It blurred the line between crime and necessity, turning ordinary citizens into silent participants of an economy that official propaganda condemned but reality demanded. The city's black market was a mirror of its struggle, hidden, anxious, but alive. In occupied Paris, the black market became a strange meeting place of desperation and defiance. By day the city seemed quiet, with German patrols in the streets and ration cards ruling every meal. But by night, in the back alleys of Montmartre or the hidden corners of Les Halles, a different rhythm pulsed. Farmers from the countryside would slip into the city with baskets of butter, cheese or meat tucked beneath false bottoms. Families in Paris relied on these secret arrivals, paying with jewellery, savings or even trading clothes that could be resold. In cafes that officially served only thin soups and ersatz coffee, back rooms held whispered gatherings where real wine, sausage and cigarettes passed between hands. German officers themselves were often customers, willing to spend their pay on delicacies unavailable through their own channels. This added a layer of danger, for what kept the market alive could also expose it to betrayal. A single raid might sweep up buyers and sellers alike, yet most were back in business the next night, because hunger pressed harder than fear. The ration system in France gave each person only a fraction of what they needed to live. Bread was grey and heavy, meat almost vanished, sugar only a memory. Families learned to stretch vegetables, invent recipes, and live on substitutes. Still, birthdays, holidays, and even ordinary dinners felt incomplete. It was the black market that filled these gaps. A mother might save for weeks to buy a single egg or a bar of chocolate for her child's treat. A father might risk fines to bring home a small cut of meat, knowing that such moments gave his family hope. The black market also became tied to resistance. Couriers who moved food or clothing sometimes carried messages hidden within, and networks of smugglers were often the same who helped move people across borders. To the occupying authorities, these markets were a threat, not only because they undermined rationing, but because they blurred into the underground struggle itself. For Parisians, however, survival was reason enough. There was an unspoken code. You did not ask too many questions about where goods came from. A sack of flour might have been stolen from a German warehouse, a piece of meat perhaps cut from an animal slaughtered in secret. Everyone understood the risks and looked away, because survival was a greater law than obedience. Even children grew up knowing the difference between the official shop fronts, with their empty shelves, and the hidden doors that meant possibility. They carried baskets through side streets, memorizing which stairwell to enter, which knock to give, which neighbour to trust. In this way, the black market shaped the daily rhythm of occupied Paris, not as an exception, but as a constant undercurrent. It was both fragile and resilient, feeding hope as much as hunger, and reminding people that even under occupation, life found its own way to continue in secret. In wartime Italy, the black market was so widespread that people joked it was the only economy that truly worked. After 1940, shortages struck quickly, and ration books became part of every family's life. Olive oil, pasta, meat, and even bread were restricted to meagre portions. Officially, the government promised fairness, but corruption and inefficiency meant shelves were bare. Out of this chaos grew the Borsa Nera, the Italian black market, a vast underground web of traders, smugglers, and everyday people who simply needed to eat. In Rome, Naples, and Milan, entire neighbourhoods quietly turned into trading zones after dark. Housewives carried baskets not to the state shops, but to secret courtyards where men sold food hidden under sacks, or loaded from carts that appeared only for minutes at a time. The language of the black market became familiar to all. A nod, a glance, a wordless signal was enough to begin an exchange. For many, cigarettes became the strongest form of currency, even more trusted than lira. One American cigarette could buy fruit, 3 might buy a bottle of wine, and a full pack could mean fresh meat. Soldiers stationed in Italy quickly realized their rations carried enormous value. Some sold extra goods to locals, others bartered for services or comfort. Allied occupation later expanded this trade even further, creating entire networks where chocolate, coffee, and canned food flowed from army supplies into the hands of desperate civilians. In the south, where fighting destroyed crops and disrupted supply lines, hunger was sharper than in cities. Families would walk for miles to meet farmers willing to part with flour or beans. In return, they might offer furniture, clothing, or even heirlooms passed down through generations. People said the war stripped not only pantries but homes themselves, as chairs, tables, and jewellery vanished into the current of barter. Yet even as it fed survival, the black market drew criticism. Newspapers condemned profiteers who hoarded goods only to sell them at staggering prices. A kilo of bread might cost 10 times its official price, butter even more. Some saw it as exploitation, but others argued that without it many would have starved. Authorities tried to strike back. Police raided suspected warehouses, propaganda urged citizens to resist temptation, and fines were heavy. Still, the system was too deeply rooted. The Bossa Nera was flexible, moving from one street to another, changing faces and names with each week. In some towns, even officials relied on it, quietly buying food for their families while publicly denouncing it. Italians developed a resigned humour about the whole system. They spoke of miracle meals that appeared from nowhere, of uncles who knew someone who could find anything, of neighbours who transformed scraps into feasts by mixing official rations with hidden purchases. The black market did not only fill stomachs, it sustained spirit by preserving a sense of normal life. A birthday cake baked with smuggled sugar, a bottle of wine shared at a wedding, a warm coat stitched from hidden fabric. These were small acts of defiance against scarcity. In the end, the Borsa Nera revealed the resilience of ordinary Italians who, faced with a failing system and a devastating war, created their own ways to endure even in the shadows. In the Soviet Union, black markets carried an especially dangerous weight, for here the penalties were among the harshest of all. Moscow, Leningrad, and countless towns lived under strict rationing, where every gram of bread or sugar was carefully counted. Officially, the system promised equality, but in practice shortages were extreme. People queued for hours only to find shelves empty, and ration coupons were often worth less than the paper they were printed on. In such conditions, underground trade became not just a temptation but a matter of survival. Known quietly as fartsovka, or simply illegal dealing, this hidden economy moved through alleys, courtyards, and sometimes even within factories. Workers would slip out bits of flour, cloth, or tools, trading them later for food their families desperately needed. Farmers returning from the countryside often carried sacks of potatoes or grain hidden under hay, hoping to sell them in city back streets. The risk was immense. Discovery could lead to confiscation, imprisonment, or worse. Yet the practice endured, because without it, countless families would have gone hungry. Leningrad during the siege presented the most extreme case. Official bread rations sank so low that people survived on crusts mixed with sawdust or other fillers. In that desperate environment, any chance of finding real flour, a handful of dried fish, or a spoon of sugar meant life itself. Soldiers and civilians alike whispered of secret exchanges, a candle for a piece of bread, a coat for a bowl of soup. Even as bombs and hunger surrounded them, people risked everything for a few stolen moments of nourishment. Moscow's underground market was more complex, tied closely to corruption. Some officials skimmed supplies, passing them into the hands of traders who sold them at high prices. A loaf of bread might cost a week's wages, a kilogram of meat an impossible fortune. Cigarettes again acted as a shadow currency, traded for food, warmth, or medicine. Children became runners, carrying messages or small parcels because they attracted less suspicion. Families sometimes pooled resources, combining bits of food bought illegally with official rations to create meals that felt almost whole. Beyond food, clothing and fuel were in constant demand. Winters bit hard, and coal or firewood fetched enormous prices. People bartered tools, books, even family heirlooms for a few logs to keep their homes from freezing. Medicines too were quietly traded. A bottle of alcohol could be swapped for aspirin, a wool blanket for bandages. For those who participated, the black market was not seen as crime, but as the only possible path to survival under impossible conditions. Soviet propaganda denounced black marketeers as enemies of the people, and newspapers told stories of selfish profiteers. But many ordinary citizens quietly ignored such warnings. They knew too well that survival was impossible without bending rules. Even Red Army soldiers sometimes traded their rations when visiting cities, exchanging tinned food or chocolate from supply lines for goods their families needed. The irony was that while the state condemned the underground trade, its own shortages fueled it, creating a cycle that no amount of punishment could end. In Soviet cities during the war, the black market was less about luxury and more about staying alive, a grim but necessary shadow of daily life. In Britain and the United States, black markets did not carry the same immediate threat of starvation as in occupied Europe or the Soviet Union, but they still flourished wherever rationing limited daily life. In Britain, ration books became as common as house keys, controlling everything from sugar and butter to clothing and fuel. The government urged citizens to see rationing as fair and patriotic, a way of ensuring that no one went without. Posters declared "Dig for Victory," encouraging home gardens, while radio programs shared recipes for stretching small portions. Yet beneath this careful system, a thriving underground trade quietly grew. Housewives who needed an extra egg for a birthday cake or a bit more meat for Sunday dinner learned quickly where to knock. Farmers in the countryside often held back a portion of produce, selling it directly to locals who had cash or other goods to trade. In London's alleys, butchers sometimes sold cuts of meat under the counter, tucked into paper bags with quiet nods. Clothes too were rationed, and the Make Do and Mend campaign encouraged people to patch garments until they nearly fell apart. But in hidden corners of markets, bolts of fabric or second-hand suits circulated at prices far beyond the official scale. Cigarettes, once again, became a universal currency, carried by soldiers and traded by civilians. The black market in Britain was so widespread that authorities launched campaigns against it, staging police raids and publishing headlines about profiteers. Still, it remained a stubborn reality. People told stories of buying a whole chicken at night, only to discover by daylight that it was half bone and gristle. Others risked money on supposed luxury goods, receiving instead diluted alcohol or watered-down perfumes. Yet even when cheated, customers returned, because the official system could never satisfy every need. In the United States, rationing began later, but when it arrived, it shaped civilian life in unexpected ways. Gasoline was the most precious commodity, tightly restricted to keep the military supplied. To own a car was often to own a problem. Tanks sat idle unless their owners could find extra fuel. On back roads and in rural towns, cans of gasoline changed hands quietly, sometimes traded for cash, sometimes for food or services. Sugar, coffee and meat were also rationed, leading to similar underground exchanges. Farmers sold to neighbours off the record, while city residents whispered about connections who could provide butter or chocolate. In many cases, Americans did not see this as crime, but as a practical adjustment. The war effort was distant for some, but the desire for familiar comforts was immediate. Weddings, birthdays, and family gatherings felt incomplete without sugar for cakes or coffee to share, and so people found ways. Authorities in both Britain and America fought these markets, but the truth was that enforcement was uneven. Sometimes police cracked down, other times they looked away. The black markets in these countries did not usually mean life or death, but they did reveal how even the most disciplined societies bent rules when daily life became too restrictive. For many families, a little extra butter or a hidden can of fuel was more than convenience. It was a reminder of normalcy, and in wartime that reminder was priceless. In Eastern Europe, the black market carried its own unique character, shaped by occupation, resistance, and the constant movement of front lines. In Poland, daily life under Nazi control was marked by extreme rationing. The official allotment of food was barely enough to keep a person alive, and for Jewish families in ghettos it was even worse, often reduced to a few hundred calories per day. Survival depended almost entirely on smuggling. Children crawled through holes in walls or slipped through sewers to bring back bread, potatoes, or even a handful of berries. These children became lifelines, their small bodies carrying more weight than their years could bear. Adults too formed networks, hiding flour in carts of firewood or sewing bacon into coats. Punishment for smuggling was brutal, yet hunger drove people forward. In Warsaw, the black market operated almost openly in some streets, with vendors displaying goods under the watchful eyes of both German patrols and desperate buyers. Cigarettes, flour and medicine commanded the highest prices, and transactions happened quickly, often in coded language to avoid betrayal. Czechland saw a similar underground trade. Factories worked under German oversight, but workers found ways to slip out goods. A bar of soap, a piece of cloth, or a handful of spare parts could be traded for food. Farmers quietly sold produce behind barns, often knowing full well they risked confiscation or arrest. Even so, these secret trades built a silent bridge between countryside and city, allowing families to survive in otherwise impossible conditions. The Balkans added yet another layer. In Greece, famine swept through the population after the Axis occupation disrupted supply lines. In Athens, black marketeers sold bread at prices far beyond what ordinary workers could pay. creating a grim divide between those with resources and those without. For many, the only choice was barter: jewellery, family heirlooms, or even houses traded away for food. Stories spread of families selling everything they owned for a sack of flour. In Yugoslavia, resistance movements often intersected with underground trade. Partisans relied on villagers who provided food in exchange for protection, or supplies taken from raids. In mountain villages, a goat or sack of grain could be more valuable than gold. These exchanges were not just about survival, but also about building networks of loyalty and trust in a fractured land. Across Eastern Europe, the black market became both a symptom of desperation and a tool of endurance. It allowed resistance fighters to eat, city dwellers to find medicine, and children to carry hope home in small parcels. It was dangerous, often deadly, yet it stitched together a fragile thread of life in places where official systems had collapsed entirely. Each transaction was more than trade. It was an act of quiet defiance against a world bent on taking everything away. Neutral countries during the war also felt the quiet pull of black markets, though in these places the trade often looked different from the desperate exchanges in bombed-out cities. Switzerland, surrounded by conflict but untouched by direct fighting, became a crossroads where goods, money and information passed in secrecy. Officially neutral, it maintained strict rationing of its own, limiting coffee, meat and fuel. Yet Swiss traders quickly discovered that borders leaked, and smugglers carried items in and out under cover of night. A sack of coffee from France, a few litres of German petrol, or a roll of silk meant for wealthy clients could fetch remarkable prices. Businessmen in Geneva and Zurich often balanced between legal commerce and shadow trade, their actions shaded by ambiguity rather than open defiance. Portugal, another neutral state, became famous for its role in the tungsten trade. Tungsten was vital for hardening steel, and both Axis and Allied powers sought it desperately. Official sales were recorded, but hidden deals flourished as Portuguese merchants quietly sold extra shipments through secret channels. At the same time, Lisbon developed a reputation as a city of intrigue, where refugees, spies and businessmen mingled in cafes. Behind the polished fronts, back rooms echoed with whispers of exchange. Diamonds, artworks, and gold moved through the city, traded for cash or safe passage. Black markets here were not only about food, but about survival of another kind, the survival of identity and freedom for those fleeing occupied Europe. Turkey, sitting between warring alliances, faced its own version of underground trade. Food supplies were tight, and rationing reached into daily life, but its position as a bridge between East and West gave smugglers endless opportunities. From its ports flowed shipments of chrome, a resource both sides coveted. Official contracts masked layers of hidden trade, and merchants who could navigate the shifting tides of diplomacy grew wealthy, while ordinary citizens searched for bread or coal in small alleys of Istanbul. Here too the black market was not always about greed. Families sold homemade bread, knitted clothes, or small amounts of fuel on the side, building a quiet economy that softened the edges of rationing. In these neutral lands, the black market often operated in daylight, just beneath a thin veneer of legitimacy. Governments sometimes tolerated it, sometimes fought it, but they could never erase it. Too many interests, commercial, political, personal, depended on those secret transactions. For people who lived there, the black market was less about desperate survival and more about bending rules to maintain comfort, status, or safety. Yet whether in the shadowed streets of Lisbon, the mountain valleys of Switzerland, or the markets of Istanbul, these trades carried the same essence found everywhere in wartime: the human impulse to find a way forward when official systems could not keep pace with need. Across Asia, the black market revealed itself in ways both familiar and unique, shaped by colonial rule, occupation, and the vast distances of the Pacific War. In China, already suffering from years of conflict before the global war erupted, official systems of supply were fragile. Japanese occupation in many regions brought strict controls, Yet the underground trade flourished. In Shanghai, a city split between foreign concessions and occupied zones, markets thrived in the shadows of neon signs and crumbling alleys. Rice, the most basic staple, became the heart of exchange. Families bartered jewellery, clothing, even furniture for a few bowls of grain. Traders risked arrest by smuggling rice from rural farms into cities, often moving at night in small boats along hidden waterways. Medicines, scarce in hospitals, circulated through these secret networks at prices only the wealthy could afford, while ordinary families relied on herbal substitutes or home remedies. In occupied Manila, the black market took on a particularly dramatic role. The Japanese authorities imposed strict rationing, but supplies were insufficient and hunger grew severe. Underground traders became lifelines, smuggling food from rural provinces into the city despite roadblocks and checkpoints. American goods left behind before the fall of the Philippines, from canned milk to soap, were hoarded and resold at staggering prices. Cigarettes once again became an unofficial currency, passed from soldiers to civilians and from civilians to traders. Stories spread of families trading entire heirlooms for sacks of rice, a sign of how far desperation had reached. Yet these markets were also targets for punishment, with Japanese forces conducting raids and arrests, making every transaction a dangerous gamble. In Japan itself, the black market began quietly, but expanded rapidly as the war dragged on. Rationing covered nearly every necessity: rice, fish, clothing, even matches. Official shops could not provide enough, and queues stretched endlessly. In the back streets of Tokyo and Osaka, hidden stalls and informal vendors offered what the state could not: a few extra vegetables, a piece of meat, or fabric for clothing. Prices soared beyond reason, yet people paid because there was no alternative. After American bombing raids, as destruction left neighbourhoods in ruins, these hidden exchanges became even more essential. Families relied on them not for luxuries, but for the bare essentials of survival. Children carried small baskets through alleyways, their errands carefully rehearsed to avoid suspicion. Farmers in rural areas became powerful figures in this hidden economy, for they controlled food that city dwellers desperately needed. Barter thrived. Kimonos, watches, and even houses were exchanged for sacks of rice or sweet potatoes. By the final years of the war, the black market was no longer hidden. It had become the everyday reality of Japanese cities. Across Asia, whether in occupied China, the Philippines, or Japan, these shadow economies reveal the same truth. When official systems failed, people turned to one another, creating fragile networks of trust and risk. Each exchange was a quiet act of endurance, a way of keeping life alive in the darkest years of war. In Africa and the Middle East, the black market unfolded along the shifting lines of empire, desert campaigns, and vital supply routes. Cairo, Alexandria, and other Egyptian cities became hubs of military activity, crowded with British troops, colonial workers, and local traders. Official rations flowed through army depots, but outside the gates, goods slipped away into hidden channels. Cigarettes, tinned meat, and chocolate bars meant for soldiers often ended up in crowded bazaars, where locals and foreigners alike bargained under the glow of oil lamps. For Egyptian families, these items were more than luxuries. They were symbols of opportunity in a time of hardship. In North Africa, shortages of bread and fuel pushed people to barter anything of value. Camels carried smuggled sacks of flour across desert tracks, while fishermen secretly sold part of their catch to black marketeers instead of turning it over to official buyers. Even within Allied ranks, soldiers became part of this trade. An English soldier might slip a few tins of spam to a market trader in exchange for silk or jewellery, while an American GI might use cigarettes as currency for a hot meal cooked outside the barracks. These exchanges blurred the boundary between military and civilian life, weaving soldiers into local economies in ways commanders tried but failed to control. In the Middle East, Palestine and Lebanon experienced similar patterns. Rationing imposed by British authorities sought to keep order, but the diverse populations and constant troop movements made enforcement impossible. Wheat and olive oil, staples of the region, appeared on underground markets at high prices. Traders who once sold spices or textiles now turned to dealing in petrol, sugar or canned goods. Families struggling with shortages relied on cousins or neighbours who had access to army stores or contacts with smugglers. In Iraq and Iran, where Allied supply lines known as the Persian Corridor carried enormous quantities of goods to the Soviet Union, theft and diversion became routine. Crates of food, fuel, or even military equipment quietly disappeared along the route, only to reappear in local markets. Villagers marvelled at tins of American fruit or British uniforms suddenly available in stalls, evidence of how global war spilled into local lives. Authorities tried to crack down, but the sheer volume of material made it impossible. Traders in Baghdad or Tehran learned to navigate a delicate balance, selling foreign goods to eager customers while keeping enough secrecy to avoid punishment. Across Africa and the Middle East, the black market was less about resisting occupation and more about seizing opportunity in a turbulent time. It allowed families to endure shortages, gave traders unexpected wealth, and created connections between locals and foreign soldiers that might never have existed otherwise. It was not always born of desperation. Sometimes it was born of ambition, resourcefulness, or simple chance. Yet in every deal, from Cairo's noisy bazaars to the silent desert caravans, the shadow of war lingered, turning ordinary trade into a hidden drama of survival and adaptation. On the seas, the black market took on a character as fluid and unpredictable as the tides themselves. Ports became natural gateways for hidden trade, places where sailors, dock workers and locals quietly wove an economy beneath the official war effort. In Gibraltar, Malta, and ports along the Atlantic, Allied and Axis goods flowed in and out with the same restless energy. Ships carried fuel, food and weapons across oceans, but some of those supplies never reached their intended destinations. A crate of canned peaches might vanish from a hold, a barrel of wine might be siphoned before delivery, and cigarettes, ever valuable, often slipped into the pockets of men who knew the networks waiting ashore. Sailors themselves were key players in this maritime black market. Weeks or months at sea left them eager for comforts, and when they docked, their rations became bargaining tools. A sailor's chocolate bar or pair of boots could be traded in a portside tavern for silk, alcohol, or even companionship. Some sailors carried small stashes intentionally, knowing they would fetch better value on shore than in their mess halls. Dock workers, too, played their part. They knew every corner of the warehouses, every weak link in the chain of oversight. At night, carts would roll from the docks with goods hidden beneath tarps or sacks of grain. By morning, these goods reappeared in market stalls, untraceable and already woven into the fabric of local trade. In the Mediterranean, Italian and Greek fishermen often joined the underground flow. They brought in their catches by day, but by night some carried contraband, fuel siphoned from military stores, foreign cigarettes, or sacks of grain taken from supply convoys. Small boats were harder to monitor than convoys, and naval patrols could not possibly catch them all. On the other side of the world, Pacific ports told similar stories. In Manila before the Japanese occupation, and later in Sydney, Auckland and Honolulu, black markets thrived around the constant movement of Allied fleets. American sailors arriving with rations of coffee, chocolate or nylon stockings found eager buyers. In return, they often sought local alcohol, handmade souvenirs, or services that eased the strain of war. These exchanges, though technically forbidden, became so common that they blurred into the expected rhythm of port life. Smuggling by sea also carried higher stakes. Ships carried strategic cargo, oil, rubber, precious metals, and wherever such cargo moved, temptation followed. Crews sometimes diverted small amounts, slipping them to waiting contacts. Even whispers of such activity worried commanders, for it meant resources desperately needed for the front might be lost to personal profit. Yet no system, no matter how tight, could fully close the cracks. The sea itself encouraged secrecy. Vast spaces and shifting crews made oversight nearly impossible. In wartime ports across the globe, the black market revealed the timeless truth that wherever ships and sailors gathered, trade, both legal and hidden, would follow. It was as much a part of maritime life as salt air and restless waves, and in the chaos of war it became another thread in the fabric of survival and adaptation. Wherever occupying armies set foot, the black market followed like a shadow. Soldiers arrived with uniforms, weapons, and rations, but they also carried the power to bend rules and shift resources. In towns across Europe and Asia, civilians quickly learned that soldiers often had access to goods far beyond what ordinary people could find. An American GI's cigarettes or chocolate were treasures in France, Italy, or the Philippines. A German soldier's canned meat or fuel could mean survival for a family in occupied territory. Even Japanese troops, supplied through strict military channels, sometimes leaked rice or tinned fish into local hands. These exchanges blurred the line between official presence and underground economy. In France, children often ran to meet Allied soldiers, asking for gum or candy, which became small but unforgettable symbols of liberation. Yet behind those innocent gifts lay deeper networks. Soldiers traded boots, fuel, or blankets for wine, fresh food, or even companionship. Military police tried to curb such exchanges, but the flow never stopped. The very abundance of military supplies compared to civilian scarcity made black markets inevitable. In occupied Eastern Europe, German troops often bartered stolen goods or supplies directly with locals. Some did so for profit, others simply to improve their own diets with fresh eggs, bread, or milk. Civilians, though wary of collaboration, often had no choice but to engage, since the official ration system was cruelly insufficient. These trades carried moral complexity. Was it survival, collaboration, or exploitation? For many, the answer depended on the day. The Japanese occupation in Southeast Asia created similar contradictions. Soldiers sold rice or fuel to civilians, sometimes secretly, sometimes openly, even though official policy forbade it. Families who despised the occupiers still bought from them, because refusing might mean hunger. In Italy, after the Allied landings, black markets exploded. British and American soldiers traded army rations for local wine and fresh produce. Cigarettes again became the most universal coin, used by soldiers and civilians alike. Street corners filled with traders offering almost anything: silk stockings, fuel, canned goods, often sourced directly from military depots. Commanders investigated, but the trade was too vast, too woven into daily life to uproot. These exchanges revealed how war blurred human roles. Soldiers, meant to enforce order, became part of hidden economies that slipped beyond command. Civilians, meant to obey rationing, took risks to feed their families or to recover small joys. Every deal carried its own balance of risk and necessity. Across occupied and liberated lands alike, the black market showed how even in uniform men were still human, trading, bargaining, and seeking comfort in a world turned upside down. Medicines and medical supplies became some of the most sought-after items in wartime black markets. Across Europe and Asia, official hospitals were overwhelmed, pharmacies were empty, and civilians faced sickness with little more than rationed aspirin or homemade remedies. In such conditions, every vial, tablet, or bandage carried immense value. In occupied France, rumours spread quickly if someone knew where to find real penicillin or morphine. These supplies were meant for military use, guarded closely, yet small amounts often slipped out through sympathetic nurses or corrupt officials. A mother with a sick child might pay weeks of wages for a single bottle of cough syrup. In the ghettos of Eastern Europe, underground doctors relied on smuggled supplies to keep their patients alive. Resistance groups often helped move medical goods alongside food, hiding them in false-bottom crates or sewing them into clothing. In the Soviet Union, hospitals rationed even basic bandages. Families sometimes washed and reused them, but those who could pay found ways to buy fresh ones from black marketeers who who had access to factory shipments. Painkillers were even more precious. Soldiers wounded at the front relied on military hospitals, but civilians had to turn to secret sellers who charged enormous sums. In Germany, where bombing raids filled hospitals with casualties, city residents searched desperately for disinfectants or iodine. Pharmacies displayed empty shelves while in hidden back rooms, small packets of medicine were quietly sold at high prices. Allied countries saw their own versions. In Britain, penicillin was introduced during the war but reserved strictly for soldiers. Civilian demand quickly gave rise to illegal trade, with diluted or counterfeit doses appearing in shadow markets. In the United States, rationing of certain drugs like quinine, needed to treat malaria, created shortages, especially for families with members in tropical regions. Smugglers found ways to bring small quantities through ports, selling them quietly to those who could not wait for official supplies. Even hospitals themselves became part of the underground flow. Overworked doctors sometimes turned a blind eye when nurses diverted small amounts of morphine or bandages to their families. In Italy, priests and doctors collaborated to hide medical supplies for both civilians and partisans, knowing that official distribution left many untreated. These black markets were not about indulgence but about survival. A loaf of bread might sustain life for a day, but a vial of penicillin could save it altogether. Every transaction carried hope, desperation, and often secrecy, because exposure meant punishment for both buyer and seller. Yet without these hidden networks, countless people would have faced illness and injury with nothing but despair. The black market in medicines revealed the raw truth of war, that even in times of vast destruction, the smallest items, a pill, a syringe, a clean bandage, could mean the difference between life and death. Fuel was one of the most powerful currencies of the war, and black markets for coal, wood, and gasoline became as vital as food. Without energy, families froze, factories stalled, and armies halted. Governments imposed strict rationing, but hidden trade thrived wherever shortages bit deepest. In Britain, coal was rationed for civilian households, and winters grew bitterly cold. Families often gathered in a single room around a weak fire, saving every lump. Yet on back streets, traders offered sacks of coal at steep prices, often taken from rail yards or diverted before reaching official depots. Wood also became precious, with families cutting trees illegally at night, or buying smuggled logs brought in carts under tarpaulins. In Germany, coal was diverted from mines to unofficial buyers who paid in cash or food. Factory workers sometimes slipped small amounts out, selling them to neighbours desperate to heat their apartments. In Berlin, rumours circulated of officials themselves quietly buying fuel from the very markets they condemned. For civilians, the choice was stark: obey ration rules and shiver, or pay black market rates and keep children warm. In occupied France, gasoline became the most sought-after commodity. The German military controlled supplies, leaving French civilians with bicycles or horse-drawn carts. Yet in hidden corners of Paris and Lyon, cans of petrol circulated. Farmers used them to keep machinery running. Resistance groups relied on them for sabotage operations, and ordinary citizens who still owned cars paid fortunes for a few litres. Much of this fuel came from siphoning military stores, a dangerous but lucrative practice. In the Soviet Union, fuel shortages were constant. Families often burned furniture or books when official coal rations failed. Still, underground trade endured. Soldiers sometimes sold fuel from army depots, while villagers transported wood secretly into cities. Trains brought limited supplies, but entire wagons could mysteriously lose part of their load along the way, reappearing in markets. In Italy, after the Allied landings, fuel black markets exploded. Soldiers traded gasoline for wine or food, and locals resold it at even higher prices. Motorbikes and trucks that should have been idle kept running through this hidden supply chain. Even in the United States, where production was higher, rationing of gasoline created a quiet but notable underground market. Drivers with extra coupons sold them illegally. while mechanics sometimes siphoned fuel from tanks to resell later. Authorities staged crackdowns, but demand never vanished. Energy was more than comfort, it was survival. A warm room in winter, a working tractor, or a truck able to move food could mean life or death. That urgency kept the black markets alive despite constant risk. For countless families, the price of fuel was not simply measured in money, but in the warmth of a child's breath, or the glow of a lamp in a darkened world. Clothing and household goods became central to black market life during the war, for rationing extended far beyond food and fuel. In Britain, the government introduced the clothing ration in 1941, giving citizens a limited number of coupons each year. A single coat might consume most of a family's allowance, leaving little for shoes or children's clothes. Posters encouraged make do and mend, urging people to repair garments endlessly, but patches could only last so long. On hidden stalls in London and Manchester, bolts of fabric, second-hand suits, or children's shoes were sold for cash or cigarettes. Many of these items came from diverted factory stock, or from sailors who carried textiles from abroad. Housewives treasured even small scraps of cloth, which could be turned into dresses for growing children. In Germany, clothing shortages grew severe as the war stretched on. Civilians found themselves reusing uniforms or cutting coats into smaller garments for children. The black market stepped in, with traders offering wool, leather and buttons at extraordinary prices. Tailors became part of the underground system, sewing secret commissions with fabric provided quietly by buyers. Some garments were made from unravelling old materials, re-dyed to look new, then sold discreetly. In occupied France, silk stockings, long associated with elegance, became a symbol of the hidden economy. German officers often bought them as gifts, while French women sought them to hold on to a sense of normal life. A single pair could cost as much as several weeks' wages, yet demand never fell. In Italy, fabric smuggling became common, with farmers' carts carrying hidden bundles of wool or cotton alongside their food supplies. Even Soviet cities saw brisk trade in clothing. With winters harsh, coats, boots, and blankets became priceless. Soldiers sometimes sold uniforms or boots, while civilians traded household valuables for warm garments. In Leningrad during the siege, a pair of shoes might mean survival in the freezing streets. Beyond clothing, household goods also filled underground markets. Pots, pans, lamps, and even soap were scarce. A simple bar of soap fetched high prices across Europe, while candles were hoarded and resold in dark alleys. In the United States, where shortages were less extreme, rationing of rubber and leather led to black markets for tyres and shoes. Farmers often relied on hidden trades to keep tractors moving with new belts or boots for workers. These markets were not only about survival, but about dignity. To clothe children properly, to keep a home lit and clean, to preserve even fragments of normal domestic life. These were powerful reasons people turned to the underground economy. Every hidden exchange in fabric, shoes, or household items reminded families that even amid war, they could hold on to a sense of humanity, however fragile. Luxury items, though not essential for survival, often dominated the imagination of wartime black markets. Alcohol, tobacco, and sweets became symbols of comfort, defiance, and even hope. In Britain, pubs continued to serve beer, but stronger spirits were scarce. Whiskey and brandy slipped into underground trade, often diluted or counterfeit, but still commanding high prices. A bottle might change hands several times, from a sailor to a dock worker to a hidden cellar in London's East End. Cigarettes were even more powerful. They circulated as universal currency, easier to spend than money itself. A few cigarettes could buy meat, fabric, or even medicine. American GIs brought cartons across the Atlantic, and soon packs of Lucky Strikes became as valuable as gold. In bombed-out neighbourhoods, a single smoke passed between friends offered a brief escape from fear. Across occupied Europe, tobacco held the same weight. In France, German officers bartered with civilians, exchanging rationed cigarettes for wine or cheese. In Italy, black market tobacco often came from smugglers who dried and rolled local leaves, selling them in back alleys. Though harsh in taste, it gave people the illusion of normal life. In Germany, shortages led to substitutes made from herbs or leaves, yet real cigarettes from soldiers or smugglers fetched extraordinary sums. Sweets told another story. Chocolate, candy and sugar were luxuries almost erased by rationing. Children in London, Paris or Berlin often grew up without them, their only hope lying in the underground market. Parents saved money for weeks to buy a bar of chocolate for a child's birthday. When American troops arrived in Europe, their habit of handing out gum and candy created unforgettable memories. Those small gifts, though innocent, were part of the larger shadow economy, as some soldiers sold surplus for extra cash. In the Soviet Union, vodka was both rationed and controlled by the state, yet it flowed through hidden channels. Soldiers and civilians alike traded for it, using it as medicine, comfort, or celebration. Barrels disappeared from depots, bottles appeared in city markets, and homemade spirits, samagon, were distilled secretly in kitchens and barns. These bottles were exchanged for bread, clothing, or even shelter. For many, alcohol served not just as luxury, but as relief from the unbearable weight of war. Luxury items in wartime black markets carried more than material value. They restored morale, gave moments of joy and preserved rituals of social life. A toast with smuggled wine, a cigarette shared under blackout skies, a sweet offered to a child, each was a small act of resistance against scarcity. While governments condemned such indulgence as wasteful or unpatriotic, for ordinary people, these luxuries provided strength to endure. The black market was not only about filling stomachs, but also about feeding spirits, and in those dark years, spirit mattered as much as survival. Art, gold, and jewellery moved through the black markets of the Second World War like shadows of lost wealth, carrying both risk and allure. In occupied Europe, as families faced hunger and poverty, many turned to their most precious possessions. Rings, watches, and necklaces, symbols of generations, were quietly traded for bread, coal, or medicine. In Warsaw, Paris, and Rome, hidden stalls accepted gold as readily as cigarettes, converting heirlooms into survival. For many, the decision was heartbreaking. A wedding band sold for a sack of flour, a family cross exchanged for fuel. These trades revealed how war stripped away not only homes and food, but even the treasures of memory. In Germany, stolen art became part of both official plunder and underground trade. Masterpieces seized from Jewish collectors or occupied territories often disappeared into private collections, but smaller works slipped into black markets. Traders offered sketches, antiques, or silverware in dimly lit rooms, their origins never questioned. Civilians sometimes bought such items at reduced prices, knowing they carried both beauty and danger. In Italy, similar exchanges thrived. Paintings, sculptures, and ornate furniture appeared in hidden auctions, where officers, merchants, and desperate families gathered. While some collectors sought profit, others traded only to convert possessions into food or warmth. In neutral countries like Switzerland and Portugal, the black market became a crossroads for wealth-escaping war zones. Gold smuggled across borders was melted into bars, losing its origin but gaining anonymity. Diamonds from occupied Belgium travelled secretly to Lisbon, where dealers turned them into cash for refugees or profit for traders. These precious stones carried not only value but stories of flight, survival, and betrayal. The Soviet Union saw its own shadows. Families sold or hid icons, silver spoons, and jewellery passed down through centuries. Some traded them directly for sacks of potatoes or bottles of vodka. Others smuggled them into city markets where they fetched high prices. Officially, such trade was condemned, but authorities themselves were sometimes buyers, seeking beauty in a time of ruin. Artworks also served as bargaining chips for safety. In France, Jewish families often handed paintings or jewellery to friends, hoping they would be returned after the war. Some were sold in underground exchanges never to be seen again, while others resurfaced decades later. The black market turned these treasures into survival currency, stripping them of cultural context and reducing them to raw value. Yet they still carried symbolic weight. To trade gold for bread was to admit that memory alone could not feed a family, but it was also to trust that life mattered more than possessions. The movement of art, gold, and jewellery through black markets during the war revealed the profound human cost of survival. It was not greed alone that fueled these exchanges, but necessity, sacrifice, and the desire to preserve life at the expense of beauty. In every hidden trade, a fragment of history changed hands, its true worth measured not in money, but in the fragile hope it bought. Weapons and ammunition were never meant for civilians, yet in the hidden networks of war they became part of the black market's shadow economy. Across occupied Europe, rifles, pistols, and grenades changed hands in basements, barns, and forest clearings. Some of these weapons were stolen from warehouses, others scavenged from battlefields, and many smuggled in through resistance networks. In France, the black market in arms was closely tied to the resistance. Farmers who pretended to sell food sometimes carried pistols beneath their carts, delivering them to fighters in the countryside. Allied airdrops added more supplies, but these too could slip into underground trade. A gun might be sold for money, or exchanged for food by someone desperate enough to part with it. For resistance groups, every hidden weapon was a chance to strike back, but for profiteers, it was simply valuable contraband. In Eastern Europe, arms markets were even more active. In Poland, smugglers risked everything to bring in weapons, often bribing guards or hiding parts in shipments of coal or lumber. Pistols and ammunition circulated through ghettos and underground cells, their value rising with every German patrol that passed by. A single revolver could mean protection, escape, or even the chance of sabotage. In the Balkans, partisans fought entire guerrilla wars sustained by black market weapons. Villagers traded livestock or jewellery for rifles, while smugglers brought bullets through mountain passes at night. The line between patriot and profiteer blurred, for the same trader who sold food in daylight might deliver grenades at dusk. In the Soviet Union, strict control over arms meant the black market was deadly dangerous. Still, soldiers sometimes traded captured German pistols for vodka, or slipped cartridges to family members in exchange for favours. These small leaks applied criminals as well as partisans, showing how war eroded the boundaries of control. Even in Germany itself, stolen ammunition found its way into hidden circles. Soldiers on leave occasionally sold weapons to acquaintances, and some arms meant for training quietly disappeared. In Asia, black markets for weapons grew around occupied territories. In China, rifles captured from Japanese troops or bought from corrupt officials kept resistance fighters alive. In the Philippines, guerrillas relied on smuggled ammunition, sometimes bought directly from Japanese soldiers willing to trade for food. These trades carried enormous risks, for discovery often meant execution. Yet the demand never ceased, because in war, weapons were more than tools. They were survival, power, and hope. Alongside guns and bullets, secrets themselves became contraband. Maps, codes, and military documents occasionally slipped into hidden trade, sold to resistance cells or rival forces. Spies paid in gold, jewels, or promises of escape. Just as bread or coal could be smuggled, so too could knowledge, and in some cases it was the most valuable currency of all. The black markets of weapons and secrets were darker than those of food or clothing, but they revealed the same human truth. Where need existed, where desperation pressed hard, people found ways to trade, even when the price was a risk of death. Currency itself became a crucial part of wartime black markets, for official money often lost its meaning under rationing and occupation. In many cities, people trusted cigarettes, food, or gold more than the banknotes issued by governments. Still, hidden exchanges of cash flourished, often tied to smuggling, bribery, or even espionage. In occupied France, German marks circulated alongside francs, creating a confusing dual system. Civilians often preferred black market deals in foreign currency, which held more stability than the inflated local notes. Traders whispered about who could provide American dollars or British pounds, useful not only for buying goods, but for preparing escape routes or bribing officials. In Germany itself, counterfeit currency appeared on hidden markets. Some of it was forged by Allied intelligence operations designed to destabilize the Reich's economy, but much was produced by opportunists hoping to profit. Passing such notes was risky, yet desperate buyers sometimes accepted them, preferring any cash over none. The Soviet Union presented a different picture. Officially only rubles mattered, but in secret people used foreign coins and notes as a more reliable store of value. Soldiers returning from the front occasionally smuggled captured currency, which fetched high rates in Moscow's underground exchanges. Barter remained stronger than money, yet hidden currency markets kept moving, sustained by those who believed rubles could not guarantee survival. In the Balkans and Greece, inflation destroyed local currencies. Families carried stacks of worthless notes, trading them for even a single loaf of bread. In such chaos, underground dealers offered stable alternatives: gold coins, jewellery, or foreign currency. British pounds smuggled in by resistance groups became lifelines, buying supplies in secret and funding operations. Traders often carried these coins sewn into clothing or hidden in shoes, knowing they were safer than paper money. Counterfeiting also became an important part of the shadow economy. In occupied Poland, underground printers produced fake ration coupons and banknotes, which flowed into hidden markets. Civilians used them to buy food or clothing, while resistance fighters used them to fund operations. Discovery meant certain punishment, but without such forgeries, many would have gone without. Even in neutral countries, secret currency exchanges thrived. In Lisbon and Zurich, brokers and cafes discreetly bought and sold foreign banknotes, turning them into tools for refugees or spies. For the wealthy, it was a way to preserve fortunes in uncertain times. For ordinary families, a few hidden dollars or pounds meant hope for a safer future. Across the globe, wartime black markets proved that money was not only about paper or coins, it was about trust, risk, and the promise of survival. Whether through genuine dollars, forged marks, or hidden gold coins, currency in the shadows became as much a weapon as any rifle, shaping lives and choices in a world where official economies often collapsed under the weight of war. Food fraud became one of the darker sides of wartime black markets. With rationing strict and hunger constant, traders discovered that desperate people would buy almost anything if it resembled real nourishment. Across Europe and Asia, counterfeit or adulterated food circulated through hidden stalls and backroom exchanges, sometimes offering relief, sometimes delivering only disappointment. In Britain, meat was among the most rationed items, and black market butchers often stretched supplies by mixing scraps of different animals or adding fillers. Sausages might contain little more than breadcrumbs and fat, yet they were sold as delicacies. Some vendors dyed old meat to make it appear fresh, wrapping it in paper and slipping it into baskets under the counter. Buyers knew the risks but often accepted them, for even questionable meat was better than none. In Germany, powdered substitutes replaced coffee, and ersatz products filled shelves. The black market expanded on this, offering real coffee at high prices, though much of it was mixed with roasted barley or chicory. Butter was another target. Traders sometimes sold blocks of coloured fat as genuine dairy, fooling buyers until they tasted it at home. In cities like Berlin or Hamburg, families learned to test goods cautiously, cutting into loaves or smelling meat before trusting it. Occupied France and Belgium saw similar fraud. Black market milk was often watered down, cheese padded with fillers, and wine diluted yet sold at premium cost. Farmers who risked punishment to sell genuine produce sometimes found themselves competing with impostors. Yet even knowing the risks, people continued to buy. Holidays, birthdays, and family gatherings demanded something special, and if authenticity was uncertain, hope was enough. In Italy, fishmongers sold catches that had spoiled, masking the odour with strong herbs or smoke. In Athens, during the famine, bread made with sawdust or strange fillers appeared in hidden stalls, traded to starving families who could not afford to question its contents. The desperation was so great that even harmful products found eager buyers. In the Soviet Union, rumours spread of flour mixed with chalk, oil stretched with kerosene, and sugar cut with salt. Whether true or exaggerated, such tales reflected the constant fear of being cheated when survival was at stake. Across Asia, similar deceptions thrived. In Japanese cities, black market rice was sometimes mixed with husks or pebbles to increase weight. In the Philippines, hidden vendors sold meat from unverified sources, leaving families unsure of what they were eating. Despite danger of illness, people bought because hunger left no alternatives. Authorities tried to fight fraud as fiercely as black markets themselves. Posters warned citizens against dishonest traders, police raided stalls, and courts handed down punishments. Yet enforcement was limited, and the demand never ceased. Food was too essential, and desperation too strong. The black market's food fraud revealed not only the creativity of sellers, but also the vulnerability of buyers. In the end, every purchase was a gamble, weighed between hunger, hope, and fear. It was a cruel reflection of how war warped even the most basic human act, sharing a meal. Children and teenagers became unexpected figures in the black markets of World War II. Their small size, quick movements, and ability to attract less suspicion made them valuable couriers and traders in cities and occupied towns. In Warsaw, children crawled through holes in ghetto walls, slipping past guards with sacks of potatoes or handfuls of bread. Some carried food tied beneath their clothes, others hid cigarettes in their shoes. These young smugglers risked their lives daily. Many were caught, yet countless families depended on their courage. In Paris and Brussels, teenagers acted as runners between farmers and city buyers. They peddled bicycles loaded with eggs or butter, sometimes hiding goods in baskets under flowers. To occupying soldiers, they looked like ordinary youths. To black market networks, they were essential links. In Italy, children sold cigarettes individually in streets, breaking open packs received from soldiers. A single stick could buy a meal, and the sight of boys calling out offers in alleys became common. In Germany, where rationing was strict, children often carried parcels for parents, their innocence making them less likely to be searched. Some traded toys, marbles, or even homemade trinkets, slowly learning the unspoken codes of barter. In the Soviet Union, orphans displaced by war entered city markets as sellers of scraps, candles, bits of bread, or matches. They often worked in groups, watching each other's backs while navigating crowds. For them, the black market was not only survival for families, but survival for themselves. Teenagers, meanwhile, were bolder. Many joined smuggling rings, moving coal, flour, or even weapons under cover of night. In the Balkans, some acted as guides for partisans, trading food for information. In Greece, starving youths carried loaves from countryside to Athens, slipping through checkpoints with clever disguises. Adults sometimes condemned the use of children in such dangerous work, yet few alternatives existed. Families with nothing relied on their youngest to bring home scraps. The children themselves adapted quickly, learning to negotiate, deceive, and survive. Some even took pride in their roles, boasting of daring escapes or clever tricks against patrols. For them, the black market was both terrifying and empowering, shaping childhoods into something harsher than games. Across continents, wartime black markets turned children into traders, couriers, and negotiators. Their laughter mixed with whispers of deals, their playtime replaced by the serious task of survival. It was a loss of innocence, but also a testament to resilience. These young participants carried not only food, but hope. sustaining families in a world where even childhood had been swallowed by war. Women were at the very heart of wartime black markets, often running them quietly while maintaining the appearance of ordinary domestic life. With so many men at the front, women became the managers of households, and with ration books insufficient, they turned to hidden exchanges to keep their families alive. In Britain, housewives lined up at official shops by day, but many had secret contacts by night. A knock on the door might bring an extra egg, a small packet of tea, or a bit of meat wrapped in paper. Women organised these networks carefully, balancing risk with need. In occupied France, mothers often acted as negotiators in back rooms of cafes or alleys of markets, trading jewellery or clothing for food. They disguised these deals as routine errands, carrying baskets that looked harmless to patrolling soldiers. Many developed reputations as trustworthy, becoming quiet pillars of the underground economy. In Germany, women were equally resourceful. As bombs destroyed homes, they salvaged clothing, furniture, and food scraps, reselling them in hidden stalls. Some worked in factories and smuggled out materials, wrapping fabric around their waists or slipping tools into bags. Others served as intermediaries between farmers and city families, biking through checkpoints with baskets of bread or milk. Italian women played a similar role, especially after the Allied landings, when markets swelled with military goods. They sold cigarettes individually, cooked meals from smuggled ingredients, or offered homemade wine in exchange for soap or sugar. Women also carried moral weight in these markets. They justified illegal exchanges as acts of protection, preserving children's health, or honouring traditions with holiday meals. In Greece, starving mothers sometimes bartered wedding rings or heirlooms for bread, their sacrifices both heartbreaking and heroic. In the Soviet Union, women braved harsh penalties to sell food, fuel, or clothing. They stood in freezing streets with hidden parcels, often watched by police, but driven by the need to feed families. For many, the black market was not just survival, but an extension of motherhood and responsibility. Women's participation also shaped the tone of these markets. Unlike smugglers or profiteers who chased wealth, many women dealt only enough to keep households stable. They built webs of trust, relying on word of mouth, loyalty, and secrecy. In every occupied city, one could find stories of women who knew exactly which door to knock on, which alley to enter, which neighbour could be trusted. Wartime black markets often carried a masculine image of shady dealers and criminals, but in reality women sustained much of the system. Their quiet resilience turned illegal trade into a lifeline, proving that survival often rested in hands both steady and unseen. Men, too, played defining roles in wartime black markets, though often in different ways from women. Soldiers, workers, and professional traders all left their mark on this hidden economy, sometimes out of necessity, sometimes out of profit. Soldiers were perhaps the most visible. In occupied France, Italy, and the Pacific, men in uniform often became suppliers of coveted goods. American GIs traded cigarettes, chocolate, and canned meat, while German soldiers slipped butter, fuel, or sugar into deals with locals. Some soldiers saw it as a way to supplement their income. Others simply wanted fresh food, wine, or comfort beyond their rations. Military authorities condemned such exchanges, yet they were nearly impossible to stop. Men at the front and in barracks understood that their rations carried more power in civilian markets than in mess halls. In industrial cities, male workers also shaped black markets. Factories that produced uniforms, boots, or machinery were carefully monitored, but men still found ways to smuggle out scraps of leather, cloth, or tools. These items reappeared in hidden stalls or were exchanged for food. In Germany and the Soviet Union, where labour was harsh and shortages constant, men risked punishment to steal or barter from their workplaces. Such acts blurred the line between crime and survival, but for many, it was the only way to provide for families. Professional black marketeers, often men, ran the networks that connected countryside to city. In Italy, Groups of men moved livestock, grain and fuel by night, bribing guards along the way. In Poland, gangs organised smuggling rings, transporting food into ghettos or trading arms with resistance fighters. These men operated on larger scales than housewives or children, turning hidden trade into a dangerous business. Some became wealthy, earning reputations as profiteers, but others used their networks to sustain entire communities. In neutral cities like Lisbon, Istanbul and Zurich, mail brokers filled cafes and hotels, whispering about currency, gold and art. They acted as middlemen, linking desperate refugees, wealthy exiles and spies. For them, the black market was less about hunger and more about opportunity, a chance to profit from war's chaos. Men also dominated black markets in alcohol and fuel. Dock workers siphoned barrels from ships, mechanics sold spare parts from depots, and drivers sold gasoline ration coupons. In many cases, their strength or access to heavy labour gave them the advantage in moving bulk goods. Yet not all male participation was driven by greed. Fathers often risked arrest to secure food or medicine for their children. Farmers traded secretly with city dwellers, ignoring quotas to help neighbours survive. In the Balkans and Eastern Europe, men carried sacks of flour or coal through forests at night, guided not by profit but by duty. Men in wartime black markets embodied both extremes, profiteers who grew rich in shadows and quiet providers who risked all for family. Together with women and children, they kept the hidden economies alive, proving that survival during war demanded participation from every hand. Elderly people often played a quieter but still significant role in the black markets of World War II. While they lacked the strength to haul sacks of coal or cross forests with contraband, their wisdom, patience and social networks made them valuable participants in hidden trade. In many families, grandparents became guardians of ration books. They knew how to stretch coupons, when to queue, and which shopkeepers might be open to a quiet deal after hours. In Britain, older women were often seen as steady figures at underground stalls, selling knitted goods, second-hand clothes, or small amounts of food they had managed to save. Their presence attracted less suspicion, for they looked like ordinary pensioners rather than traders. In occupied France and Belgium, grandmothers frequently acted as mediators. Neighbours trusted them, soldiers often ignored them, and younger smugglers relied on them to pass messages or hold goods. Some became the backbone of local networks, quietly connecting farmers with city families through trusted introductions. In rural Poland, elderly farmers who no longer worked the fields still managed chickens, gardens or goats. The eggs, milk and vegetables they produced slipped easily into black market channels. For city relatives, a trip to visit grandparents often meant more than family. It meant coming back with food hidden in baskets or tucked beneath coats. In the Soviet Union, old men and women braved freezing markets, standing with small bundles of potatoes, candles or wood. They had little to spare but sold enough to buy bread or medicine. Because Soviet law punished speculation harshly, elderly vendors risked the same penalties as younger ones, yet many continued. For them, the black market was not greed, but survival in a collapsing system. Stories also tell of older men acting as couriers for partisans, hiding weapons or notes inside walking sticks or beneath heavy coats. Few suspected the elderly of carrying contraband, making them surprisingly effective messengers. In Italy and Greece, grandfathers often brought family heirlooms to black marketeers, exchanging them for sacks of flour. These trades carried deep sadness, but also determination, to keep children fed even if it meant parting with the past. Some elders provided wisdom rather than goods. They taught younger traders how to recognize honest dealers, how to spot fraud, or how to negotiate without drawing attention. Experience gave them an edge in a world where trust was scarce. Though they rarely dominated the black market, elderly men and women were threads in its fabric, offering patience, connections, and resilience. In a war that stripped away normal roles, even the old found ways to contribute, showing that survival was a task shared across every generation. Criminal networks and the mafia found fertile ground in the chaos of war, and black markets became one of their strongest lifelines. In Italy, the Sicilian mafia revived its influence by controlling food distribution, smuggling, and fuel. Villagers knew that if they wanted bread, wine, or even coal, they would likely pay through men tied to the local bosses. Allied forces, seeking order after the landings in Sicily, sometimes tolerated these groups, allowing them to strengthen their grip on hidden trade. The Borsa Nera was not just a civilian phenomenon, it became a business empire for organised crime. In France, gangs in Paris exploited rationing by controlling entire districts of black market trade. They supplied restaurants with meat and wine, much of it stolen from warehouses or diverted from official convoys. Their networks included corrupt officials, transport workers, and even collaborators. Some of the same routes that carried stolen goods also funneled weapons to resistance groups, creating a tangled world where criminal profit and patriotism sometimes overlapped. In Germany, traditional criminal gangs found opportunity in shortages as well. Smugglers operated along the borders, bringing in food and luxury items from neutral countries. Black market deals often relied on forged documents, counterfeit ration cards, or stolen military supplies, all requiring organised skill. Police cracked down, but even within the Reich, hidden crime thrived. In the Soviet Union, where punishment for speculation could be severe, criminal groups still managed to carve out space in underground economies. Thieves controlled markets in some cities, dictating prices and protecting sellers for a share of profits. Connections with officials often shielded them, revealing how corruption and crime intertwined. Across Eastern Europe, gangs took over smuggling routes across rivers and forests, charging high fees to move goods between villages and cities. These groups sometimes turned brutal, punishing those who resisted their control. In Greece, famine gave gangs enormous power. They hoarded grain and sold it only at impossible prices, creating resentment but also dependence. In the Balkans, partisan groups sometimes relied on criminals for supplies, exchanging protection for access to hidden trade. In neutral ports such as Lisbon and Istanbul, international criminal organisations operated on a grander scale. They moved gold, currency, and even art stolen from occupied lands, selling them through complex networks that reached across continents. War made borders porous, and organised crime knew how to exploit every crack. For ordinary people, the involvement of gangs was a double-edged sword. On one hand, they ensured goods were available when official shops were empty. On the other, they drove prices higher and used fear to control markets. The mafia and criminal syndicates thrived because war created demand, loosened oversight, and blurred the lines between survival and exploitation. In many regions, black markets would not have functioned without them. The war magnified their influence, leaving legacies that lasted long after peace returned. Black markets during the war forced societies to confront deep moral dilemmas. For some, trading outside the law was a betrayal of collective effort, a selfish act that weakened the nation. For others, it was the only way to keep children alive. These conflicting views created a constant tension, shaping how people judged their neighbours and even themselves. In Britain, propaganda posters condemned black marketeers as enemies within, showing shadowy figures tempting honest citizens with forbidden goods. Newspapers printed stories of profiteers caught selling meat or fuel at inflated prices, portraying them as greedy and unpatriotic. Yet behind closed doors, many who publicly scorned the practice privately relied on it. A mother who denounced profiteers at the market might still buy an extra egg for her child's birthday. The contradiction was widely understood but rarely spoken aloud. In occupied Europe, morality became even more blurred. Was buying bread from a German soldier collaboration, or simply survival? Was selling jewellery for food dishonourable, or an act of sacrifice? Families wrestled with these questions daily, and answers often shifted with circumstances. In Poland, smuggling food into ghettos was punishable by death, yet children risked it anyway, seen as both heroes and criminals depending on who told the story. In Germany, Some citizens reported neighbours who engaged in black market deals, while others quietly turned a blind eye. The Gestapo encouraged denunciations, but many ordinary people sympathised with those who broke the rules. The line between crime and necessity became so thin that judgment itself often felt impossible. In the Soviet Union, where propaganda was strongest, black market traders were branded as traitors. Official speeches insisted that every citizen must sacrifice equally for victory. Yet in practice, even loyal party members sometimes bought food or clothing illegally, driven by the same shortages they were told to endure. This gap between ideology and reality created silent guilt as people balanced loyalty to the state with loyalty to family. In Italy and Greece, resentment toward profiteers grew sharp. Those who grew rich from famine were hated, even attacked, while small traders who sold just enough to survive were pitied or admired. Communities drew their own distinctions. The greedy were despised, but those who helped neighbours were tolerated. Black markets revealed the complexity of morality under pressure. Acts judged as selfish in peacetime became forgivable, or even noble, when survival was at stake. People understood the difference between exploiting misery and sharing risk. Yet the stigma never fully disappeared. Even after the war, many who had dealt in the black market kept silent, afraid of being remembered as opportunists. The moral shadow of these markets lingered, proving that survival in war was not only about food and goods, but about the uneasy choices people made in a world where right and wrong could no longer be clearly separated. Governments across the world devoted enormous effort to fighting black markets, yet their success was always limited. In Britain, officials created special enforcement units tasked with raiding hidden shops and punishing sellers. Newspapers reported dramatic arrests, with profiteers fined heavily or even imprisoned. Posters warned citizens that feeding the black market helps the enemy, appealing to patriotism as much as fear. Yet despite raids, the markets thrived. Inspectors could shut down a stall in the morning only to see it reopen under another name by evening. The persistence of shortages meant demand never disappeared. In the United States, where rationing began later, the Office of Price Administration oversaw strict controls. Citizens were urged to report neighbours who cheated the system, and counterfeit ration coupons were hunted down. Raids on gas stations and butchers occasionally made headlines. Still, hidden exchanges in gasoline and sugar continued, especially in rural areas where oversight was weaker. The very size of the country made full enforcement impossible. Germany relied on fear and punishment. The Gestapo treated black market trade as a crime against the Reich, and offenders risked prison or even execution in severe cases. Yet corruption inside the regime undermined enforcement. Some officials profited from the very markets they were meant to destroy, and soldiers themselves often sold rations. As a result, the black market in cities like Berlin remained vibrant, feeding civilians even under constant threat. In occupied France, German authorities attempted strict crackdowns, but their soldiers frequently became customers themselves. This hypocrisy weakened enforcement, and local police often looked the other way, sympathising with civilians. In Italy, both fascist and later Allied authorities raided markets, yet the Borsa Nera proved too deeply rooted. After the Allied landings, attempts to restore order met with failure as soldiers themselves supplied goods to underground traders. The Soviet Union applied some of the harshest penalties. Speculators were denounced as traitors, and courts handed down long sentences. Yet shortages were so severe that even with fear of punishment, black markets spread through cities and villages alike. Corruption inside the bureaucracy ensured survival of the trade. Inspectors themselves sometimes bought or sold illegally. Across all nations, one truth emerged. No government could fully control the black market because it was born not from greed alone, but from need. So long as rationing created gaps, people found ways to fill them. Enforcement slowed the flow but never stopped it. In the end, black markets outlasted many wartime restrictions, proving that human ingenuity and necessity were stronger than any law. When the war finally ended, the black markets did not vanish overnight. In many places they remained active for years, shaping the fragile process of recovery. Countries devastated by bombing, famine and occupation still face shortages long after peace was declared, and official rationing often continued deep into the late 1940s. In Britain, ration books stayed in use until 1954, meaning underground trade in meat, sugar and clothing continued throughout the supposed peace. Housewives who had learned the hidden routes and contacts of wartime markets kept using them, while ex-soldiers added new supplies to the networks. The government tried to rebuild faith in official systems, but patience wore thin, and many saw black markets as simply part of daily life. In France and Italy, recovery was uneven, and the black market became a bridge between ruin and renewal. Traders who had thrived during the war sometimes transformed into legitimate businessmen, using their networks to open shops or transport firms. Others, however, clung to smuggling and profiteering, leaving authorities to battle organised crime well into the 1950s. In Paris, the same alleys that once sold bread and butter quietly shifted to perfumes, fashion, and foreign cigarettes, showing how underground economies adapted to new desires. Germany's post-war years brought an explosion of black market activity. With the Reich collapsed and currency nearly worthless, cigarettes became the dominant money of daily life. In ruined cities like Berlin, barter ruled. A pack of American cigarettes could buy a pair of shoes, a winter coat, or even rent for a room. Children gathered discarded butts from the streets, while adults traded rations for foreign goods brought by soldiers. It was only after the currency reform of 1948 that the black market began to lose its power, replaced by renewed trust in stable money. In the Soviet Union, underground markets that had flourished during the war never truly disappeared. They evolved into what became known as the second economy, a hidden layer of trade that coexisted with the official planned system for decades. Families who had survived by bending rules carried those habits forward, shaping a culture of quiet transactions beneath the surface of state control. Beyond economics, black markets left deeper marks on society. They changed how people viewed authority, trust, and survival. Many who once condemned profiteering admitted to relying on it when times grew desperate. Communities remembered both the cruelty of those who hoarded and the kindness of those who shared. In some places, black markets fostered resilience and resourcefulness. In others, they bred cynicism about government promises. Either way, they became an inseparable part of the wartime memory, a reminder that the struggle for survival continued long after the guns fell silent. Personal memories of wartime black markets often reveal details that statistics and official reports cannot capture. In diaries, letters, and family stories, people described the secrecy, the small victories, and the lingering shame or pride tied to these hidden trades. A British woman recalled saving scraps of clothing coupons to secretly buy her daughter a new dress from a backroom dealer, writing that it felt like stealing joy from the war itself. Another remembered a neighbour's quiet knock late at night, offering a precious egg in exchange for tea. These small trades left deep impressions because they carried not just goods but moments of hope. In occupied France, memoirs often mention the smell of roasted coffee drifting from hidden cafes, or the thrill of finding a bar of chocolate for a child. Writers remembered the moral compromises, buying from Germans, dealing with profiteers, but also the gratitude of seeing children smile. For many, those memories were bittersweet, tied to hunger and danger, but also to the will to live. In Germany, post-war interviews with civilians frequently returned to the image of Tauschhandel, or barter trade. One man recalled trading his father's watch for a sack of potatoes, admitting it felt like selling history for survival. Women often remembered sewing uniforms into civilian coats, or trading family linens for coal. These stories showed the creativity and sacrifice woven into black market life. In the Soviet Union, letters between family members tell of the quiet exchanges that saved lives. One soldier wrote to his wife about slipping her extra sugar from his rations, knowing she would use it in trades at the local market. Survivors of the siege of Leningrad often spoke of the desperation that made every morsel priceless, and the gratitude they felt toward neighbours who risked punishment to share. In Italy, oral histories collected decades later were filled with humour as well as sorrow. Grandparents told grandchildren about the borsa nera, remembering the strange meals made from smuggled flour, the watered wine that tasted of smoke, and the endless search for cigarettes. These tales, passed down in kitchens and family gatherings, turned hardship into folklore, shaping how new generations understood the war. Even in the United States, veterans wrote home about the informal trades they witnessed abroad: cigarettes for silk stockings, chocolate for wine, and how these exchanges made foreign cities feel strangely alive. For many families, the black market became part of the personal mythology of survival. A loaf of bread, a bottle of medicine, or a bar of soap carried through secret doors could be remembered for a lifetime. These cultural and personal recollections remind us that the black market was not only an economic system, but a human story, etched into memory as clearly as ration cards or bombing raids. The story of World War II black markets ultimately tells us less about crime and more about human nature. Wherever shortages struck, people turned instinctively to hidden trade, not because they were greedy, but because they wanted to survive, protect their families, and hold on to fragments of normal life. The existence of these markets showed that no system, no government decree could fully suppress the need for exchange. Survival always found a way. From London to Leningrad, from Rome to Manila, the patterns repeated. Rationing created gaps, and the black market filled them. Sometimes it was a child carrying bread through a hole in a wall, sometimes a soldier trading cigarettes for wine, sometimes a grandmother parting with her wedding ring for coal. These actions were often condemned in official speeches, yet quietly tolerated because everyone knew that without them, countless lives would have been lost. Black markets revealed resilience. They proved that ordinary people, faced with extraordinary hardship, became resourceful and inventive. They learned to barter, to smuggle, to negotiate trust in a world where trust was scarce. They also revealed contradictions: profiteers who grew rich while others starved, criminals who exploited misery, but also neighbours who shared their little extra to keep others alive. The moral lines blurred, reminding us that war collapses simple judgments of right and wrong. These hidden economies also left lasting marks. In Germany, the cigarette currency shaped post-war recovery. In the Soviet Union, wartime underground trade evolved into a second economy that lasted for decades. In Western Europe, memories of secret deals and quiet exchanges lingered in family stories long after ration books were gone. For some, the black market was a symbol of shame. For others, it was remembered as the only reason they endured. Looking back, black markets of World War II can be seen as mirrors of humanity under stress. They reflect fear and hunger, but also determination and care. They show that even when laws fail and systems break, people continue to seek connection through trade, through trust, through risk. They also remind us that survival is not always noble or clean. It is messy, complicated, and deeply human. In the end, the black market was not only a shadow economy, but also a testimony to the strength and fragility of human beings in wartime. It teaches us that in the darkest conditions, people will still search for ways to provide, to protect, and to hope. And that perhaps is its most enduring legacy: the quiet proof that survival is always stronger than scarcity,